In the decades after Jesus' death, his followers spread out in small groups, often meeting in homes. They depended on memory, trusted witnesses, and repeated teaching. When they wanted scripture, they turned to the Hebrew scriptures they already knew, reread through the belief that Jesus mattered. Nothing like a New Testament existed yet. Authority lived in people and in shared tradition, not in a settled stack of Christian books. As these communities grew, new problems followed. Disagreements surfaced, questions demanded answers, and distance made guidance harder. So leaders wrote letters. These writings aimed at real situations, conflicts, ethics, worship, money, leadership. They were not treated as a matched set, and they were not written to build a library. They carried weight because they came from recognized voices, but they still functioned like urgent mail, read aloud and passed on. The more those letters circulated, the more a quiet shift began. A message first heard as advice started to sound like a standard. If one church benefited from a letter, another church wanted it too. Copying followed, and so did selection. Some writings seemed clearer, more useful, more connected to the earliest witnesses. Others faded. Long before formal lists appeared, the first pressure built. Which words deserved to be repeated everywhere, and which belonged only to one moment? Paul's letters did not stay where they first arrived. One church received a letter, read it aloud, and then faced a simple problem. Other communities needed the same guidance. So copies got made. Messengers carried them along the same routes that connected these scattered groups. A message meant for one town began to shape believers hundreds of miles away. And once that happened, the letters stopped feeling merely local. Copying changed the status of the writing. If a letter helped settle disputes in one place, it seemed useful somewhere else too. But usefulness raised a bigger question. Did Paul's words carry weight everywhere, like a shared rule, or only where he personally wrote? And if one apostle's letters circulated, what about letters linked to other leaders? Communities began collecting, comparing, and passing along what they trusted most. That sharing created the first real pressure to decide authority across churches. A local reading tradition no longer stayed local. Different groups now held different bundles of apostolic writings, and they did not always match. When teachings lined up, the network felt stronger. When they did not, the tension grew. The basic issue became unavoidable. Which writings bound all Christians and which ones only spoke to a moment? In the decades after the first letters spread, something new began to appear. Written stories of Jesus' life. Starting in the 70s and continuing into the 90s, communities put memories into full narratives, teaching, miracles, conflicts, death, and resurrection. These were not one official book. Different churches received different accounts, and once a gospel existed in writing, it could travel, be copied, and be read aloud again and again. That changed weekly worship. A church might hear one gospel read as its main story of Jesus, while another church, miles away, heard a different one. When travelers moved between communities, they carried these texts with them. Soon people noticed similarities and differences. Some details matched closely, others did not. The result was simple and unavoidable. Believers began comparing what they heard about Jesus side by side and asking what carried the most weight. The comparisons did not stay private. Leaders taught from these written accounts, and listeners absorbed a particular version of events as the familiar one. But as more gospel circulated, a question formed beneath the surface of ordinary church life. If multiple written narratives existed, which ones deserved to shape belief for everyone? Each community already trusted what it had received. Yet now, trust had competitors. The push toward agreement began with that new reality. In the early 2nd century, a new kind of Christian writing spread. Some texts claimed hidden teachings Jesus gave only to a few. Others offered new origin stories about the world, evil and salvation. These works circulated alongside the familiar letters and Gospels, and in some communities they sounded exciting, even more spiritual. The problem was simple and explosive. Different groups read different books and all insisted they carried the real truth. These alternative writings forced church leaders into a harder job than before. It no longer worked to say a text felt helpful or sounded wise. Now they needed reasons. They asked who wrote it and whether it truly came from the apostles or their close circles. They watched for consistency with what churches already taught in worship. They checked whether a book was read widely, not just in one tight network that guarded its message. As the arguments sharpened, the word apostolic became a kind of test. A writing had to connect back to the earliest witnesses, not just claim secret access. Leaders warned that a private gospel could not shape the public faith of the churches. This pressure changed everything. Instead of a loose library of respected texts, Christians started treating the question of Scripture like a boundary line, something that defined who they were and who they were not. By the middle of the 2nd century, one bold teacher forced the issue into the open. His name was Marcion. He looked at the Christian writings being read in different places and decided the church needed a clean, fixed collection. But his solution cut sharply. He kept only a version of Luke's Gospel, edited down, and a small set of Paul's letters. Everything else he set aside. That move changed the argument overnight, because Marcion did not just prefer certain texts, he acted as if his list replaced the rest. He treated the God of Israel's scriptures as a problem, not a foundation, and his canon reflected that. Churches that might have tolerated variety now faced a clear choice. Either they accepted a narrow Bible with a rewritten story, or they defended a bigger inheritance. So a wider reaction followed. Leaders pushed back by insisting that Christian scripture could not be built on one edited gospel and a handful of letters. The faith had to rest on a broader, recognized stream of apostolic writings shared across communities. And it had to include the Old Testament, not as a discarded past, but as the continuing root of the Christian message. Marcion's list provoked an answer: widen the canon or lose the story. By the late 2nd century, the argument no longer stayed theoretical. Churches needed workable habits, what got read aloud, what got copied, what got trusted. So patterns formed. Across wide areas, the same 4 Gospels kept turning up together, not as random favourites, but as a set. Matthew, Mark, Luke and John travelled as a collection. That regular use did what speeches could not. It created momentum. Alongside those Gospels, Acts gained space as the bridge text. It connected Jesus' story to the spreading movement, and it made the apostles feel like part of one continuous line. As communities compared notes, a rough map appeared. These were the writings that sounded consistent, that matched what other churches read, and that seemed tied to apostolic origins. No council settled it yet. Practice settled it first. But the edges stayed messy. Some writings looked useful and respected, yet they did not land everywhere the same way. A text could be cherished in one region and doubted in another. Leaders asked hard questions. Was it truly apostolic or just old and popular? Did it fit the rule of faith or pull in a strange direction? Proto-lists emerged, but they still carried footnotes in people's minds. By the 3rd century, the argument changed shape. Church leaders no longer only defended their favourite readings, they started sorting books into clear categories. Some writings were accepted and read everywhere. Others were disputed, used in some places, doubted in others, and some were rejected as unreliable. That shift mattered. It meant Christians admitted out loud that not all Christian books carried the same weight. Major theologians became the public referees of this process. Origen, a famous teacher and Bible scholar, compared what different churches treated as scripture and reported the disagreements plainly. In other regions, other leaders did the same. They noticed patterns. The four Gospels and Paul's letters looked increasingly secure, while texts like Hebrews, James, and Revelation still triggered hesitation depending on the location. Regional tradition now shaped the results. A church in one area trusted a book because it had been read there for generations. Another doubted it because it arrived late or lacked a clear apostolic link. The categories helped communities argue with shared terms, not just gut feeling. Agreement grew, but it grew unevenly. The Christian world moved toward a common collection, while still sounding like several different libraries. In the 4th century, everything changed because Christianity stopped being a hunted movement and started being legal. After Constantine, churches no longer hid in small homes as often. They appeared in public, with larger gatherings, public teaching, and leaders expected to speak with one voice. That new visibility created a new problem. You could not build a public church life on a fuzzy set of texts. A shared scripture list became a practical need. Legal status also meant wider coordination. Bishops travelled more, messages moved faster, and decisions in one region carried weight in another. When teachers trained new clergy, they needed the same core books from place to place. When sermons aimed at whole cities, the readings had to sound familiar. Disagreements that once stayed local now caused friction across a connected network. Uniformity stopped being an ideal and became an administrative pressure. And there was another force, copying. Public churches required more manuscripts, and copying demanded choices. Scribes needed to know which books deserved time, money, and careful preservation, and which ones did not. A mixed collection created confusion and invited accusations of error. So church leaders leaned harder on the categories already forming: accepted, disputed, rejected, and pushed towards stable collections that could be read, taught, and reproduced everywhere. By the 4th century, the pressure to settle the question of books no longer stayed local. Churches needed the same scriptures for reading, teaching, and copying on a wider scale. So, leaders began to put their judgments in writing. These canon statements did not invent new texts. They drew a line through a messy inheritance. The goal stayed practical. Which books could be trusted everywhere, not just in one city? One influential voice came from Athanasius, a major bishop in Alexandria. In a public letter sent out in 367, he listed the exact 27 writings that later Christians called the New Testament: 4 Gospels, Acts, Paul's letters, and the remaining general letters, ending with Revelation. That list mattered because it named in one place what many churches already leaned toward, while quietly pushing disputed favourites to the side. Soon, regional synods moved the same direction. Councils at Hippo in 393 and Carthage in 397 echoed the 27-book list in their own decisions, shaping practice in North Africa and beyond. Disputes did not disappear overnight, but the range of maybe books shrank fast. Copyists followed the new expectations. Teachers cited the same set. By the end of the century, most churches worked from a shared, usable New Testament. Most Christians lived with a simple assumption. The New Testament meant 27 books, no more and no less. That number looked permanent, printed at the front of nearly every Bible and repeated in sermons, study notes, and church classes. It felt like it had always been there. A single table of contents quietly shaped belief, worship, and identity. For many people, the question never even arose. But that neat list hid an earlier reality. For centuries, churches had operated without one agreed set, and they had made choices locally. Some communities leaned heavily on certain letters. Others preferred particular gospel collections. Some books circulated in one region and barely appeared in another. Even when many writings sounded familiar, the edges stayed fuzzy. People debated, compared, and argued because the stakes felt enormous. The modern Bible had erased that experience by design. Printing locked the order in place, mass distribution repeated it, and later translations carried the same core list into countless languages. Stability became normal, yet early Christians had lived in a moving world of hand-copied manuscripts, uneven access, and competing bundles of texts. What later looked like a settled book had once been a long negotiation. The certainty came at the end, not the beginning.